There's a silence in the desert that doesn't wait to be broken. It waits to break you. You're listening to Dark Lullabies, twisted bedtime stories for adults, written by Penelope Ann Ashbourne. Settle in, keep the lights low. The story starts now. I remember the unrelenting sun, a bleached disk in a cloudless sky that turned the world into a haze of white and gold during the day, and the moon that followed shimmering over endless dunes at night. I had volunteered for the Middle East deployment, maybe out of some restless yearning for purpose, or a half-formed idea of testing my mettle in foreign sands. Whatever my reasons, the reality was a desert outpost situated miles from any semblance of civilization, surrounded by an ocean of shifting dunes and a horizon that never seemed to change. Our forward operating base was a cluster of canvas tents and weather-beaten shipping containers surrounded by HESCO barriers. The nearest village was a tiny speck of clay homes and corrugated rooftops, accessible only via a winding dirt track that blended into the desert. Most nights were spent on patrol or rotating watch on the perimeter, scanning the empty stretch of dunes for any sign of threat or movement. More often than not, we saw nothing but swirling dust devils or the fleeting shadows of prowling jackals. It was routine, if you can call sweltering heat, tension, and perpetual exhaustion routine. Then, about 3 months into our deployment, we were assigned to a reconnaissance detail further north, an area rarely visited by coalition forces. The mission was vague: survey an abandoned structure, confirm if it was being used for illicit storage or infiltration routes. We loaded into 2 Humvees at dawn, the air already thick and searing, and travelled a rough, pitted track for hours. By midday, the sun had become an oppressive weight pressing down on our shoulders. A scalding wind battered us with grains of stinging sand that seeped through every gap in our gear. Eventually, we reached a place the locals referred to simply as the crossroads, though no visible roads intersected there. It was an expanse of cracked earth surrounded by rocky outcroppings, each topped with the remains of ancient walls. The outpost we sought was allegedly concealed among these crumbling ruins. There had been whispers, half rumour, half myth, that the site was once a fortress from some lost epoch, possibly older than any known civilization. Locals avoided the area, claiming it was cursed, haunted, or worse. I couldn't help but dismiss the idea as superstition. Yet even for someone like me who liked to think himself grounded, there was an undeniable tension that settled around us when we dismounted. The wind died abruptly, as though the place were holding its breath. The silence was so absolute that the rattle of my gear sounded thunderous in my own ears. I exchanged uneasy glances with the others, Corporal Reed, Specialist Gonzalez, and a couple of younger privates whose names are hard to recall now. We found our way to the structure in question, a low rectangular building fashioned from sun-baked bricks, half buried by shifting sands. We approached with the standard caution, fanning out, weapons at the ready. The building's entrance was a lopsided arch that offered an interior as dark as a tomb. Signs of human presence were minimal. No fresh footprints, no scattered shell casings, no trash left behind. Still, we had our orders. Reed and I ventured inside while Gonzalez and the others secured the perimeter. Inside, the temperature dropped by at least 15 degrees, as though we had stepped into a subterranean crypt. Our flashlights cut through swirling dust motes, revealing worn carvings on the walls, spirals, geometric shapes, some forms that looked vaguely human but with elongated limbs and distorted faces. The place was deserted, yet the air felt charged, as if with static electricity. Each step we took echoed unnaturally, as though the interior was more expansive than it had any right to be. The main chamber led to a smaller alcove at the back, partially collapsed, revealing a slope of packed earth and broken stone. Reed crouched to examine a portion of the wall that sported a series of etched symbols. He reached out to brush away the dust, and I remember the fine hair on my arm standing on end as he did so. The moment his glove touched the ancient carvings, I heard a faint whisper, so soft it might have been my own heartbeat. I could feel something invisible move through the still air. "Hey, Sarge," Reed said, shining his flashlight over the strange etchings. "You ever see writing like this?" I shook my head, uneasy. Looks older than anything I've come across. Let's snap some pictures for the intel guys. While Reed took photos, I scanned the room, panning my flashlight slowly. I found more carvings in the corners, figures in contorted poses, arms raised as though in supplication to something above them. The faint whispering sensation returned, edging closer to my hearing range, yet never fully audible. It might have been the wind through a hidden crack, but it carried a cadence that seemed too purposeful. We spent perhaps half an hour inside, photographing every inch we could, verifying there were no hidden compartments or fresh footprints. Then we emerged back into the blazing sunlight to regroup. Gonzalez reported no signs of hostiles, no tracks indicating recent vehicles. Whatever the building was, temple, fortress or crypt, it appeared long abandoned. We returned to our fob that evening. I was relieved to see the distant lights of our perimeter flood lamps and the silhouettes of guard towers against a violet sky. The day had left me feeling drained, more than just the typical exhaustion from the heat. The others felt it too, a weight behind the eyes, a thickness in the air. We parted ways to fill out reports and try to catch some rest. That night I slept fitfully. My dreams were fragmented and oppressive, haunted by fleeting images of those carved figures. I saw them moving in my mind's eye, writhing as if locked in some ritual of agony or ecstasy, I couldn't tell which. At one point I awoke in my cot drenched in sweat, convinced I had heard a whisper near my ear. I tore off my blanket, scanning the dim interior of the barracks tent. Nothing. Yet the darkness seemed imbued with a presence, an echo of the day's unsettling quiet. Over the next few days I noticed a subtle change among the squad. Reed, usually outspoken and easygoing, had grown quiet and jittery. Gonzalez began having migraines so intense he was placed on light duty. One of the privates broke down during a routine weapons cleaning, muttering that something was calling his name at night. Initially I assumed the stress of deployment, the isolation and the punishing heat were taking their toll. But everything pointed back to that trip, that cryptic building among the rocks and sand. I couldn't shake the sense that we'd brought something back with us. Not a physical object, but a feeling, a presence that clung to our thoughts. Strange incidents piled up. Batteries in our equipment drained faster than usual. Electronic devices glitched inexplicably. Sleep became a battlefield of nightmares. Soldiers reported hearing footsteps or distant chanting near the perimeter fences, yet no one was ever there. A week after our reconnaissance mission, Command asked for volunteers to return to the site. Apparently, some of our photos had piqued the interest of higher-ups, or maybe an archaeological liaison. Despite our misgivings, we agreed to go back. I think, in part, we wanted answers for the sense of dread that had infected our unit. Another possibility was that we just couldn't abandon the job half-finished. This time, our convoy was larger. 4 Humvees, staffed by a rotating cast of specialists and intelligence personnel. We rolled out before dawn, engines grumbling across the desert. The mood was subdued. Even the newcomers, who had no reason to feel uneasy, seemed to pick up on our tension. The desert greeted us with the usual stark beauty, the sky tinted pale rose where it met the dunes. Yet the splendour felt illusory, concealing something dark beneath the sand. By midday, we reached the crossroads again. Once more, that uncanny stillness enveloped us. The wind died. The horizon seemed to recede, as though we had entered a place disconnected from normal geography. Dust devils spun in the distance, but never approached, as if repelled. We dismounted and formed a perimeter, while the intelligence personnel marched straight into the building, with the single-minded purpose of curious academics. Some of us lingered outside, scanning for any threats. Others, myself included, followed them inside to observe and provide security. The atmosphere was even heavier this time, the interior gloom thicker, the chill deeper. Our flashlights revealed the same carvings on the walls, only now they appeared more defined, as though someone had been cleaning them. I felt a lurch in my stomach. Dust in the corners looked disturbed, like footprints had been formed, then brushed away. One of the analysts, a wiry civilian contractor named Eleanor, studied the symbols with rapt fascination. She muttered about them being pre-Semitic, perhaps connected to an obscure civilization lost to shifting sands. She ran her fingertips over the lines, narrowing her eyes at the spiral patterns. "These lines," she said, tapping a whorl near the top of the archway, "they resemble star charts, but not any that I recognize, almost as if—" She trailed off, a troubled expression passing over her features. The entire time, I felt the hair on my arms rising. A subtle static charge seemed to course through the air. One of the new guys, a private named Henderson, stumbled backward with a strangled gasp, shining his flashlight erratically into a dark corner. When I aimed my beam there, I saw nothing but chipped stone. Yet Henderson insisted he'd glimpsed a figure, a lanky shape stooped against the wall. Gone the instant the light found it. While most of us tried to keep our composure, a tense hush fell. Even Eleanor, enthralled by the carvings, grew paler, as though she too sensed we were intruding. I felt an irrational urge to call off the entire mission, to retreat to the sunlight, but I held back. The army doesn't issue orders to leave a place just because it feels wrong. At some point, Specialist Gonzalez, despite his migraines, stumbled into a side passage. I heard him call my name with a shaky voice. I followed, only to find him standing in a narrow corridor, the walls carved with the same uncanny motifs, the floor descending as if leading to deeper chambers. A stench rose from below, stale, clammy air with a faint undercurrent of decay. "Sarge!" Gonzalez whispered. "I don't like this. Feels like we're in a crypt." I nodded, swallowing hard. A shout echoed through the corridor. Someone from the main chamber calling for help. Gonzalez and I rushed back. Henderson was on his knees, shaking uncontrollably, pointing at the far wall. "He was standing right there," he breathed. "His face was ashen, eyes wide with panic. I saw him, tall, no eyes. Oh, God!" One of the other soldiers tried to calm him, but we were all badly rattled. I scanned the area, found no footprints, no sign of intrusion, yet the darkness felt alive with possibility. Unseen corners loomed with shapes that might or might not be real. Eleanor, pale and trembling, suggested we conclude our survey. She had enough footage and photos to make her superiors happy. She openly admitted she couldn't explain the geometry of the place, how the interior seemed to extend beyond what was visible from the outside, or how the temperature fluctuated in unnatural ways. We mustered everyone, double-checked equipment, and headed out. Only upon exiting we discovered the sunlight had waned. The sky overhead glowed with the deepening reds and oranges of late evening. But that didn't make sense. We couldn't have been in there more than an hour or two. And it had been midday when we entered. The chain of events felt scrambled. Time had slipped by us like sand through our fingers. Our arrival back at the FOB was hasty and uneasy, the entire convoy blanketed by an oppressive silence. The real trouble began at nightfall. Nearly everyone who had entered that building complained of headaches, nightmares, or auditory hallucinations. The newcomers, previously sceptical, were now among the most unnerved. Eleanor locked herself in the small makeshift office used by the intelligence team, poring over the data she'd collected, refusing to speak to anyone. Henderson suffered what the medics called an acute stress reaction and had to be sedated. I walked the perimeter under a half-moon, scanning the faint outlines of dunes. Every so often I thought I saw figures drifting at the edge of the floodlights, impossibly tall, spindly silhouettes dissolving into the haze as soon as I blinked. Others claimed to hear chanting or moaning on the desert breeze. At one point the entire outpost lost power for about 5 minutes, plunging us into the blackest darkness I'd ever experienced. Voices cried out in confusion, and I thought I heard scuttling footsteps right behind me. When the light snapped back on, there was no one there. 2 nights later, Eleanor made the decision to return to the site, but alone. She left a note on her cot, scrawled in a frantic hand, implying she had to unravel the carvings, that the pattern was a key to an older realm, and she would only find peace by confronting whatever lay in that labyrinth. We discovered her absence in the morning. Her note mentioned she had stolen a Humvee with enough fuel to make the journey. Our commanding officer launched a search. I joined the detail. How could I not? The idea of her out there alone in that dreadful place chilled me. We found the Humvee near the building's entrance, door open, engine cold, no sign of her. The structure loomed against the blood-red dawn, the wind absent as ever, the hush so thick it felt like a suffocating presence. We moved in, formed search teams, and combed every passage. We found footprints leading into the deeper corridors, footprints that seemed to vanish near a half-collapsed archway. Beyond that, the floor gave way to rubble, and we couldn't proceed without risking a cave-in. Eleanor was nowhere to be found. A creeping dread took hold of us as we checked every nook and recess. In one dark alcove we discovered a cluster of bones, small, ancient, bleached by time. Animal? Human? It was impossible to tell. We regrouped in the main chamber. While we conferred, a hush fell over the group. Then, in that perfect silence, we heard a voice. A faint, high-pitched call that echoed through the corridors. It was female. It was calling for help. My stomach flipped as I recognized it. Eleanor. We fanned out in the direction of the sound, ignoring our pounding hearts. The echoes led us into a side passage we'd barely noticed before, partially concealed behind a collapsed beam. With great effort we shifted debris and squeezed through, ignoring the threatened groan of the stone overhead. The corridor we entered seemed older than the rest, the carvings more elaborate, their lines swirling in fractal patterns that teased the corner of vision. No normal architecture could explain that corridor's shape. It sloped downward at an angle that defied the building's exterior. The air grew colder with each step until our breath started misting. The flicker of our flashlights played tricks on our eyes, twisting the carvings into writhing shapes. Still, we pressed on, drawn by Eleanor's distant pleas. At last, the corridor opened into a vast chamber. The floor dropped off into a wide pit at its centre, ringed by stone steps descending into darkness. The ceiling soared high, carved with spiral motifs that resembled a swirling galaxy. And there on one of the steps leading down stood Eleanor, trembling. She was alive, but pale, her clothes torn, eyes wild. "Sergeant," she said in a weak voice, seeing me. "Don't come closer. It's here." Before we could answer, something moved in the darkness below. Our flashlights revealed a shape at once impossible and undeniable. It rose on two long limbs, draped in rotting strips of cloth or flesh. I could not be certain. It had no clear face, just an unsettling arrangement of ridges and hollows where features should be. Its proportions were terribly wrong. Elongated arms, a torso that stretched upward, and a bizarre angle to its neck. A rasping sound emerged from it, half hiss, half moan. Eleanor staggered backward with a sob, as if wrenched by an invisible hand. Without hesitation we opened fire, the deafening crack of rifles shattering the hush. The muzzle flashes lit the chamber in staccato bursts, revealing glimpses of that hideous figure. It twisted away, moving with unsettling fluidity. Bullets struck the stone steps and ricocheted in sparks. Some must have found flesh, if it was indeed flesh, yet the thing didn't fall. Instead, it melted back into the darkness with a low, keening wail that pounded in my skull. We rushed forward, forming a line near Eleanor. She collapsed into my arms, eyes rolling back in her head. The chamber walls seemed to pulse with the echoes of that wail. Something foul and ancient stirred beneath the pit, or so I felt in that moment, a presence awakened by our intrusion. My fellow soldiers exchanged panicked shouts. A couple of them fired blindly into the darkness. The stench of gunpowder and something rancid filled the air. We retreated, carrying Eleanor, our lights flickering. The corridor behind us trembled as if about to cave in. The chamber seemed to contract, the walls closing in. The hiss and clicking noise followed us, reverberating off the ancient stone. At any second I expected to feel a clawed hand on my shoulder, the cold, horrific form dragging me down into that labyrinth. Yet somehow we made it back to the outer halls. The moment we crossed the threshold into the main chamber, the sense of oppression began to lift, as though we'd left the beating heart of the place behind. We fled into the open air, squinting against the midday sun that burned away the last vestiges of the crypt's chill. No one looked back. We pulled Eleanor into one of the Humvees, slammed the door shut, and roared away across the desert, raising a plume of dust. That was the last time any of us set foot there. Command dismissed our claims of a creature in the ruins as stress-induced hallucinations, battle fatigue, perhaps. The final reports were sealed, referencing only unstable substructures and unexplained geological phenomena. Officially, we were told the site would be placed off-limits, pending further archaeological study after the conflict ended. Unofficially, I suspect no one truly wanted to unearth what lay beneath those ancient stones. Eleanor survived, though she never fully recovered from the shock. She was flown back stateside, placed under psychiatric evaluation. I heard rumours she would lapse into frantic fits, raving about doorways in the desert and shadows older than the first cities. Meanwhile, our own unit quietly rotated back home within a few months. Everyone who had been inside that place carried with them scars that no physical exam could confirm, troubled dreams, the sense of being watched in dark corners, a creeping dread whenever sand or dust drifted across our vision. Even back home, long after my discharge, I still wake in a sweat, heart pounding as I recall the swirling symbols and the hideous shape slithering at the edge of my flashlight beam. Sometimes, in the dead of night, I hear a whisper like wind over shifting sands, beckoning me to return. And I know, deep down, that the desert is patient. That nameless structure stands silent among the dunes, waiting for the next unfortunate soul to set foot across its threshold, to descend into those ancient chambers where no light can truly banish the shadows. That's why I write this now, half a world away from that cursed land. I dream of endless dunes under a merciless sun, of twisted carvings and subterranean passageways that lead too deep into the unknown. If you ever find yourself alone in that remote corner of the Middle East, where the wind dies and the dunes hush, remember our story. Remember that silence can harbour more than mere emptiness, and that some doors, once opened, can never truly be shut. That was just one of many shadows from the mind of Penelope Ann Ashbourne. If you enjoyed this story, you'll find even more twisted bedtime tales in her book, Dark Lullabies, available now on Amazon. The link is in the description. Until next time, sleep well.